The bulk of this film advance mechanism here is identical between these two cameras, so I'm only going to go through it on one camera, and the other one I'll just do off camera. There's no point watching the identical thing happen twice. There's no obvious differences for me to discuss. Right, so I'll start with the film advance shaft here. And I've got some graphite grease here I'm using, and I want to work that into the shaft so it gets between the shaft and the bush. Yeah, and looking at that, that's smeared in there nicely, so that's exactly what I wanted. I'll run a bit on the spring so that the spring will move smoothly. Now, one of the quirks of these, and I'll show you on the other advance here, I'll zoom you in. Now, this steel spring tends to bite into the nickel plated brass shaft, and you can see a line across here. Now, that's not a machined line, that's where the last coil of the spring has bitten into that shaft. In cases where this is very worn, you'll find that that groove is very pronounced, and actually the last groove of the spring, the last coil of the spring, can sort of bind in there sometimes, and you get weird stiffness with the film advance at some stages. This is quite a normal example, probably a good example. And this one here, which I've just greased up to go on the other camera, that was exactly the same. Right, so that's lubricated up. The cam surfaces here I'm lubricating with a bit of synthetic grease because it's not so messy and it works adequately for this purpose. The take-up spool, zoom you back out so you'll see nothing. The take-up spool here, the metal bush goes in the base. It's the round hole, not the slotted hole, that's at the top. We can put the take-up spool in the back of the camera and drop the advance shaft into place. Now, its rest position, swing that out the way, its rest position is here. Where the lock lever can drop down into position in that slot, and here's our release lever here, and the screw holes I can see straight through to the casting. Now, that's the rest position where it starts from. We wind a full turn of tension onto that spring when we get to that stage, so that the film advance will return to the rest position. Now, I know on one of these two cameras these three screws were loose, but I don't remember which one it was now. Doesn't make any difference because they'll be tight now. Okay, so that part's in, that's good. At the top of the camera I need to lubricate and assemble the clutch assembly. I'm going to use the graphite grease again here because it works nicely for me. So I'll wipe that around the inside of the clutch assembly part. The spring here fits over the centre component. There's a little tab on the top of the spring, has to drop into that notch. And I've got to compress the spring so I can get it into the drum. So I've got this pair of crimp lug pliers here, nice rounded jaws on it. I'll hook that over the top, pull that together gently. If I rotate that clockwise, it pulls that spring into place. Then if I take my drum, and this is the side with the recess upwards, you can see here, which is going to go down now. I slide it over the top of the tool, and there's my clutch assembled, flush on the top. The base here is set into the recess in the outer component. This will turn smoother in one direction than the other. That's fine, that's it, that's by design. A wipe of synthetic grease through the centre, drop that into position, rotate it till it drops into the notches in the take-up spool, and then I can fit the top bush for the Film Advance shaft in place. Now here we've got this little gear set on the top, or two pinions really. I just force some grease in those in the traditional fashion of putting a blob on there, pushing with my thumb, and the hydraulic pressure pushes it into place. Now I'm rotating the take-up spool with my thumb here, and that just engages the gear at the bottom with the drum, with the clutch, and that all fell into place. Two screws hold this together. This one, this shoulder screw, supports the shutter cocking rack, keeps it in firm contact with the gear on the top of the Film Advance. The one at the front here, the screw at the front, now we've got a bush that goes on there first. Now one side of that bush is countersunk. That countersink needs to go down. It should be the plain side of the bush upwards. Otherwise the screw will wind down into that countersink and it'll block the action of our little ratchet pawl. Sits on there like that, and here's the screw that goes in place. Normally I'll put a touch of grease on the top of that where it runs through that ratchet pawl, not on the threads of the screw of course, you don't need to lubricate those. That ratchet pawl just sits on there like that and it should move freely. You can tighten that screw up, tighten its mate up across the way, and there's a spring that goes on that ratchet pawl which needs to be put into place. Here it is, it's just hiding from me. The spring acts to push the ratchet pawl towards the centre. Like that. And there's gear that goes on the top of that. And I need to lubricate that with a little bit of synthetic grease. And if I rotate that anti-clockwise, it should just push the pawl out of the way and drop into place. If I set that pointing forward, that's probably about the right position. I'll just check that's sitting in the neutral position. It is. That looks good. On top of that we have this spring. Now that's dished side up. This piece goes on. This piece goes on. That washer. The gear. Now the gear has to centre on that washer correctly, otherwise it won't work properly. So I don't have the washer drifting off to one side. And then we've got the screw at the top. And our lock lever should be holding everything locked at the bottom, so I can put a bit of torque on there to tighten that screw up. That's that shaft complete, top to bottom. Next I'll put in the catch for the rewind button. And normally I just run around the rounded end of that with some molybdenum paste, and because I've got it in my hand I put it through the pivot point. That goes in here like this, hooks into place. We've got a return spring, it sits right there, and the shoulder screw that goes through the spring, through the lever and screws into the base of the camera. Just run that down, check that the lever moves freely. That appears good. And the spring, I'll zoom you in a bit, I've got to hook that into position. So the end of the spring is sitting loose here at the moment. I've got to hook it up behind there, lift it up over the top and back, so this is now sprung loaded. Just drop that release lever back into place. The sprocket needs to go in next, and the sprocket shaft. So here's the sprocket, and the end with the slot goes upwards. So I'll put that into position. The sprocket shaft, I'm lubricating the shaft towards the top, the shaft towards the bottom where it goes through the body casting, and usually for good measure I put a touch on the teeth of the gear. That feeds in from the top. It should drop all the way through, and it's hitting up against our latch catch lever there, so I pull that catch back, rotate the spool if necessary, and that drops all the way in. It's completely flush with the other gear, and now I can fit the rewind button. So I'll put some synthetic grease through the return spring, put that onto the button, put the washer onto the button, hold my finger on the top of the shaft so it can't get away, and just start that screw. Check that it'll depress, in other words that the centre of the button is passing through the washer, and that's enough for the moment. Now I've got to line up the hole in the shaft here with the slot so that I can put the screw in that'll drive it, and then we'll be able to tighten things up. So line that up. With luck that'll start. Sometimes it's reluctant to start. If you strike that, rotating the shaft 180 degrees can often work wonders, because sometimes the lead in on one side's not particularly useful. That's it. It's in tight. Right, so I just need my pliers to tighten that rewind button now, and we're in business. Okay, so that's the film advance components in. There's no tension on there, and we haven't got the lever on there, but otherwise that part's complete. So I'll put that aside and I'll do the other camera, and then we'll do the closing up of the bases. Well, I have the cameras at the same state. We'll put the newer camera to one side, start with the older of the two cameras. And what I want to do now is tension the film advance and put the film advance lever in place. So what have I got to do? Alright, first of all we'll drop the lock lever to one side, hold the release lever away, rotate the film advance shaft one full turn clockwise, drop the lock lever back in position and the release lever back into position. So now we've got a full turn of tension on there. Now I must not press the release lever at the top or the lock lever at the top, or things will unwind and it'll be a nuisance. I'll have to start again. So supporting this so it's not hitting the bench, I'll put the base plate in place, and the base plate here of course is a very truncated little piece. It's nickel plated steel. It's held in place with 3 screws. And I want to fit the advance lever in place before anything moves. So I'll get that in place, get a screw in there. I'll put all 3 in just for tidiness. 2 will do while you're testing the camera. So we've got to have 3 screws in there. Now we can test this film advance lever, make sure it moves smoothly. If I press the release button, the lever here, that's the one with the screw on the head, hold down the lock lever, I can swing the film advance lever, it'll return to the rest position, nice and neat. That's good. So that's done. That's well enough advanced as the film advance goes. That's all good, and I can that's ready now to have the cocking rack put in place. The other camera, well, that's slightly different. Our base plate here runs the full length because it's got the chrome trim on it. So we've got to do much the same thing. I'll swing the lock lever out of the way, swing the release lever out of the way, rotate this one full turn to tension the film advance, drop the lock lever and so forth back in place to hold it, and put the base plate on. Now we've got 7 screws to hold this in place, I think. As before, I've got to be very careful not to drop the camera down to the bench, because as soon as the release button or the lock lever get depressed, it would allow the film advance to unwind. And I'll lose that tension that I'd put on there so carefully. That's enough screws to start off with. That'll hold things while I put the advance lever in place. I've still got this camera hovering in mid-air. Right, just put those 3 screws in the film advance. Now I can relax a bit and get the last of the screws in this chrome trim, this trim at the base here. Okay, and check the film advance. That moves and returns nice and smoothly. So both cameras are now at the same stage. Film advance has moved nicely and they're ready to have the cocking racks installed. So we'll start here, I suppose, with the newer of the two. And what do we want? We want the chrome trim for the start. So here's the older of the two cameras. I'll put the strap lug in place at the end of the camera here, at the rewind end. 2 screws through that. Now the holes in that bracket are slightly slotted. I find that if you push it, the bracket as far to the end of the camera as it'll go, right up against the screw heads, and tighten the screws. 99 times out of 100 that's the right place for it. So the cocking rack, okay. Just taking some synthetic grease here. Lubricate the cocking rack, both sides of the lower part, on the underside. Drop that into place. What's the correct position for this? You should have 2 teeth engaged at this end. That looks right. Did you see any of that? No, you didn't. 2 teeth engaged here. This bracket holds down this end of the rack. Now the cutout here, can you see that? Yeah, you can see that cutout here, big cutout at that way, facing that way. The screw goes in this position. Chasing this all over the camera. And this post goes in here at the front position. The tool I've got for doing this job is a modified screwdriver. It's been drilled out and a slot cut across the front so it'll engage with the sides of that shaft. You better not to use a pair of pliers to twist that shaft, try and get it tightened up, because you'll mar the shaft and then the release button won't move nicely on it. I'm just checking that rack moves smoothly. It appears to. Making sure I didn't lose my engagement there. Countersunk head screw goes in this position. And I'll put this screw in at this position. No, it's not staying. That holds the meter when we go to put the meter back. We'll just run it through there anyway for the moment. And check the action of the cocking racks. So press down the release button, hold down the lock lever. That's a bit stiff. It doesn't return to the rest position easily. So this means there's some friction underneath it. Let's try loosening up this screw. I've got to figure out which end it's at. I know that the strap lug here had been distorted, which tends to make that jam up. No, I'm not feeling it loosen up a great deal doing that. No, it's not it. So the problem's not at this end. May have a bit, might need to put a shim under this, the plate at this where that screw is. So I'll just loosen this up. Look for a shim washer, and I should have one floating about somewhere. I know I took one out of these cameras and I'm not sure which camera it was now. But what I suspect is I need a shim washer under here. Well, I put that shim washer under there, but it didn't really make much difference. So I'm looking for any other reasons for that there might be tightness in this action. First I'll remove that shim washer, since obviously it didn't make a difference. It's probably not needed. And I can see a potential area of concern. Let me get this screw back in here and tighten everything up again. Alright, looking at the mesh of the cocking rack and the gear here, there is almost no backlash in those teeth, and I think that's where things are tight. So what I want to do is create a little bit of backlash. Well, how am I going to do that? Well, I'll show you. The film advance shaft here is held in place by the bush. The bush is held in place by these two screws. Now there is always some clearance with the screws, so if I slacken off that screw and that screw and I pull the film advance shaft forward, tighten the screws up, I'll have created a little bit of backlash in that gear there. So that should, if the tightness was that there was because there was too little backlash in the gear, that should move smoothly. Let's see if we're right. Well, that seems to have done the trick. Just making sure I have got everything down tight. One area you can get problems is with this bracket here, this strap lug. Particularly if the lugs have been bent either up or down by people dropping the camera or by forcing too thick a strap through it and bending the lug, it can actually distort this plate, which means that if that's pushed downwards, it'll press on the cocking rack to an undue extent and it'll cause friction. That seems to move nicely. I'm quite happy with the state of that. And I'll get my rubber band back on here before I have a terrible accident and lose something. Okay, so that's that camera. That was the older of the two cameras. Alloy body edges, and that was fitting the cocking rack and closing it up. So I'll pop that to one side. Now with this one, this is the newer of the two cameras. We have the chromed trim to go on the top of the camera. So I'll fit that in place. And this has to be fitted after you've got everything else in place really, which is a nuisance. The strap lug at the end of the camera, that's basically the same deal as before. These strap lugs I've straighten them up. They're probably not as strong as they should be because they've been distorted and they were showing stress cracks through the corners. that they're the right shape. So that goes on there. Our shutter cocking rack is exactly the same deal as the other camera. Apply some synthetic grease into the underside, a bit on that back edge. Put it in place. Now, these cameras with the chrome trim on the top, if you have the rack advanced too far here, it'll bash into that chrome trim and it won't complete the advanced stroke correctly. That's quite common. There's plenty of clearance there. I've got 2 teeth engaged. That looks okay to me. I think that'll be adequate. That's working nicely. So if you have a camera where it doesn't seem to want to complete the advanced stroke, it's quite possible that the rack's too far advanced here and it's actually hitting this chrome trim. You can see they've cut that chrome trim out there. They probably needed to do more than that, but I think that was the limit of what they could achieve. Get this in place. That's the same as before. And the strap lug is the same as before. And with the cocking rack in place, I can check the action and see if it's smooth. Yeah, that's perfectly smooth. So that's all good. That part's fine. Now I'll just get this rubber band around there where I can keep track of it. So now I've got both of my cameras complete with their film advance mechanisms and so forth, all in place. And these I've got to get my other pieces together now, which means stripping and cleaning the rangefinders, looking at the meters to see if there's anything I need to do to those. Though I don't think I will have to do anything. And those parts can be assembled to the camera. So of course, and cleaning the top covers.